The maintenance report hit the boardroom table like a verdict. Vanessa Cole did not slam it down for drama. She placed it there the way a surgeon places a scalpel, with precision, with finality, with the cold certainty of someone who had already decided. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Cole Aerospace's headquarters looked out over a skyline that she had spent 23 years building, one contract at a time, one hostile acquisition at a time, $1 billion bet at a time. She had never once flinched from a hard decision. She was not about to start now. The board members sat in their leather chairs, ties straightened, expressions arranged into the careful neutrality of people who desperately wanted to agree with whatever she was about to say. The report was 400 pages long. She had read every word the night before, while her assistant slept on a cot in the outer office. She already knew what it said. More importantly, she already knew what it meant. "This jet," she said, and her voice filled the room without effort, without volume. "The way a cold front fills a valley, is dead." She let the word land. Dead. Not struggling. Not in need of revision. Dead. We have spent $140 million over 2 years on a project that has produced exactly 0 viable test flights. We have cycled through 3 lead engineers, 2 external consultants, and 1 very expensive partnership with a European firm that quietly walked away 8 months ago and hoped we wouldn't notice. She scanned the faces around the table. She noticed that none of them quite met her eyes. "We are burning approximately $3 million per week, maintaining a machine that does not function, inside a hangar that costs us $40,000 a month to lease. The math is not difficult. We scrap it. We take the write-down, we absorb the loss, and we redirect resources to the cargo division, which is actually generating revenue." She gathered the report, set it square on the table, and looked toward the far end of the room, where the vote would be called in approximately 60 seconds. "Any discussion before we proceed?" There was a movement at the back of the room, not from any of the executives, not from the row of senior engineers in their pressed shirts. The movement came from near the door, from a man in a maintenance uniform that bore the kind of grease stains that no amount of laundering ever fully erased, the stains that live in the fabric the way experience lives in a person, too deep to wash out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of stillness about him that made the air in the room seem to slow. He had not been invited to this meeting. He had slipped in during the slide presentation, unnoticed because no one had thought to look that far back in the room. His name badge read Brooks, E. His clearance level read Maintenance. He took 1 step forward, and the movement was small enough that it might have gone unnoticed. But Elijah Brooks had a way of making even a single step feel like a statement. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was quiet. Genuinely quiet, not performatively soft, but the kind of quiet that contains something compressed. The way still water contains everything moving beneath it. "Give me 90 days, and I'll make that jet fly again." The room did not go silent immediately. It went through 3 distinct phases. First, confusion, as people tried to locate who had spoken. Then recognition, as eyes found the maintenance uniform, the grease, marked hands, the face of a man who had no business standing in a boardroom. And then something between amusement and contempt. The particular cocktail of dismissal that powerful rooms reserve for those who speak out of turn. Laughter began at the far end of the table and moved inward, the way a ripple moves from a dropped stone. A single dad from the maintenance hangar, challenging the collective judgment of aerospace engineers with doctorates, executives with decades of industry experience, and a CEO who had personally overseen the construction of 3 commercial aircraft facilities. The absurdity of it was, in its way, almost refreshing. Vanessa Cole did not laugh. She looked at Elijah Brooks, the way a jeweler looks at a stone she hasn't priced yet, not with warmth, but with the particular attention of someone who has trained herself not to dismiss things prematurely when money is involved. 90 days. She ran the number. Against the ongoing burn rate, 90 days would cost approximately $27 million more. Against the write-down of $140 million already spent, it was not entirely irrational, but she was not a woman who made decisions based on hunches, and everything she knew about this man, which was almost nothing, suggested that this was precisely that. A hunch, a desperate, unqualified, wildly overconfident hunch. She let the laughter die. She held his gaze across the length of the conference room, and she made her calculation in silence. And she spoke with the kind of deliberate calm that people who negotiate billion-dollar deals learn to weaponize. "You have 90 days, she said. "Fail and you're fired." She did not say it cruelly. She said it the way a judge reads a sentence. The terms were the terms. Elijah Brooks nodded once. He turned and walked back through the boardroom door, and the room, which had been laughing 20 seconds earlier, found itself looking at a closed door and feeling, for reasons none of them could have articulated, slightly unsettled. Elijah Brooks woke at 4 in the morning because he always woke at 4 in the morning. It was not an alarm that woke him. He had stopped setting alarms 3 years ago because the body learns its obligations and keeps them even when the mind would prefer otherwise. He lay still for exactly 45 seconds, which was the amount of time he allowed himself to simply exist before the day began. Before the calculations started and the lists assembled themselves in his head, then he rose. The apartment was small, which was a generous way of describing it. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where the counter space was occupied, partly by a coffee maker and partly by engineering diagrams that Elijah printed from the public library because his laptop screen was too small to read them with the precision he needed. The walls bore evidence of a life lived with intention on a tight budget. Maya's drawings held up with painter's tape, a framed photograph of a woman laughing at something just outside the frame, a shadow box containing a military service medal that Elijah never spoke about and never removed from the wall. Maya was 10 years old and slept with the focused seriousness of a person who had important work to do in the morning. Elijah made breakfast without waking her. Scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice measured from a carton, and then he set her place at the table and wrote her a note on the back of a receipt because they were out of sticky notes. The note said, "Good morning. Lunch is in the blue bag. I will be at work, but I will see you tonight. I love you. He signed it the way he always signed it, with a small drawing of an airplane, which Maya had decided years ago was his signature move, and which Elijah had kept doing not because he particularly wanted to, but because Maya expected it, and expectations, in his experience, were the architecture of a child's security. He left before she woke. He did 2 jobs. The first was the one listed on his employee file at Cole Aerospace, maintenance technician, hangar division, working the overnight and early morning shift. The second was not listed anywhere. It was the job he had assigned himself in the weeks before the boardroom meeting, the one that kept him in Hangar 7 after his shift ended, cross-referencing maintenance logs by flashlight when the overhead fluorescents cycled off on their timer. People at work called him Eli, when they called him anything at all. The more precise among them called him by his last name, in the clipped way that shop floor culture assigns labels without invitation. The less precise called him what they called anyone they had decided not to fully see. Buddy, man, that guy. A small number, led by a senior technician named Dennis, who wore his condescension the way some people wear cologne too much, everywhere referred to him as the janitor. Not because Elijah's job overlapped with janitorial work, but because it was a way of saying, "You are below the level at which your opinions register." Elijah never responded to it, not because he lacked the language for response, but because he understood something that Dennis did not, that dignity is not defended through argument, it is demonstrated through results. He had learned that lesson in the Air Force, where he had spent 6 years as a propulsion systems specialist before life redirected him, in the specific and permanent way that the death of a spouse redirects a person not temporarily off course, but permanently reoriented toward a different north. His wife, Caroline, had died of an aggressive illness 4 years earlier, while Maya was 6 and still at the age when she reached for her mother's hand by reflex before reaching for anything else. The months after Caroline's death were a landscape Elijah did not describe to anyone, not even to his sister who drove from Atlanta when she heard the news and stayed for 3 weeks and cooked food he didn't eat and cried in the kitchen when she thought he couldn't hear her. He survived those months the way structures survive catastrophic loads. by distributing the weight across every available surface until nothing single point bore too much. Maya kept him functional. The work kept him present. The discipline he had built over years of military service kept him upright when nothing else did. He had turned down a position at an aerospace contractor in Virginia 6 months after Caroline died, because the position required relocation, and relocation was something Maya could not absorb. Not then, maybe not ever. He had taken the maintenance job at Cole Aerospace because it was local and stable, and allowed him to be home when Maya's school day ended. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself that 3 years ago, every night, after he dropped Maya at his neighbor Mrs. Patterson's and drove back to the hangar, he looked at the broken jet and thought, I know what's wrong with you. I know exactly what's wrong with you. One night, working by the light of a headlamp clipped to the engine access panel, Maya called him on the tablet he propped against a toolbox during late shifts. She had stayed up past her bedtime, which she only did when something was bothering her. Her face on the screen was arranged with the careful composure of a child who had decided to ask a hard question and was not sure of the reception. "Daddy," she said, "what if they're right? What if the plane just can't be fixed?" Elijah set down the tool in his hand. He looked at his daughter's face on the screen, the face that contained so much of Caroline's architecture. The same set of the jaw, the same particular angle of the eyebrows when she was working through something. "Come here," he said, meaning the camera, meaning, "Look at me directly." She leaned in. "The plane isn't the problem," he said. "The people who were trying to fix it stopped trying before they understood it." That's different. Maya considered this with the methodical patience she applied to most questions. "But what if you stop?" she asked. Elijah almost smiled. "People fear what they don't understand," he said. "The ones who told you I can't do this, they're afraid. Not of me. Of what happens if I turn out to be right." Maya seemed to absorb this. She said goodnight. Elijah put the tablet down and turned back to the engine. And that was the night he found it. It was not the kind of discovery that announces itself. It arrived the way most important things arrive, quietly, obliquely, through a discrepancy so small that a distracted eye would pass over it entirely. Elijah had been working through the pressurization control system for the 4th time, cross-referencing the current software parameters against the original design specifications, when he found a sequence of code modifications that did not appear in any authorized maintenance record. The modifications were subtle, expertly subtle, the kind of subtle that comes from someone who knows exactly how oversight systems work and knows precisely how to make an unauthorized change look, at a glance, like routine calibration. But Elijah did not glance. He read. And what he read told him that this jet had not failed because of a design flaw. It had not failed because the engineering team gave up too early, though that was also true. It had failed because someone had deliberately changed the pressurization logic in the flight management software, and had done so in a way that would cause the engine systems to misread their own operational status and shut down under simulated flight conditions. The jet wasn't broken. The jet had been broken. Those were not the same thing. He stayed in the hangar until the morning shift began arriving, and he sat with what he knew, and he tried to calculate who would believe him. Vanessa Cole came to Hangar 7 at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, and she came alone, which was unusual enough that the security guard at the checkpoint noted it in his log without quite knowing why. She had not planned the visit. She had been reviewing project financials in her car, a habit she maintained because the car was one of the few places in her life that lacked a conference call or a pending decision, and she had found herself driving toward the facility instead of home, and she had told herself she was conducting an unannounced inspection, and she mostly believed it. The hangar was large enough to contain several commercial aircraft simultaneously and was lit at night by overhead work lamps that gave everything an orange-tinged industrial glow, the kind of lighting that strips pretense from a space and shows you only what is actually there. What was actually there, in the far left bay where the project aircraft sat on its landing gear, was Elijah Brooks. He was working on the underside of the left engine nacelle, lying on a creeper board, with a battery-powered work light clipped to the engine mount above him, on a tool cabinet 6 feet away. A tablet propped against a socket wrench. Set displayed the face of a young girl, doing what appeared to be mathematics homework. The girl was talking through a problem. Elijah, from beneath the engine, was answering her. "Carry the 4, he said. "No, wait, don't carry anything yet." "What's the step before carrying?" "Finding the common denominator," the girl said. "The way children say things they have been told enough times to know without yet fully understanding." "Right, so find it," Elijah said. "Then we'll talk about carrying." Vanessa stood at the entrance of the bay for a long moment, and she was aware of a feeling that she had trained herself to be suspicious of, the feeling of being moved by something, the particular softening that happened in the presence of something genuine. She was a person who had learned to treat that feeling as a liability rather than an asset, because in the world she operated in, softening was frequently the first step toward being taken advantage of. But she stood in the hangar doorway, and she watched a man repair an aircraft while teaching his daughter mathematics. And the transaction of it, the pure, uncomplicatedly purposeful nature of it, arrived in her chest as something she didn't immediately have a word for. She walked forward. Elijah heard her footsteps and slid out from under the engine without particular surprise, the way people who spend years being overlooked learn to sense when they have finally been seen. He stood, wiped his hands on a rag that was already past the point of wiping, and waited. "Why are you still fighting for a dead jet?" Vanessa asked. Her voice was the same as it was in boardrooms, precise, uninflected, stripped of everything non-essential. Elijah looked at her for a moment. On the tablet screen, Maya had gone quiet, watching. "Because," Elijah said, "nobody fought for people like me." It was not said with bitterness. It was stated with the same factual precision as his technical reports, with the same even weight as his maintenance logs. It was, Vanessa understood, not a complaint. It was an explanation. She stood in the orange industrial light of Hangar 7 and said nothing for several seconds, and something in her recalibrated, some internal instrument that had been measuring Elijah Brooks against a familiar standard, quietly revised its reading. She reviewed his service record the next morning. She did it herself, without asking her executive assistant, which was the kind of task she had not performed personally in approximately a decade. The record was not what she had expected. 6 years of Air Force service, propulsion specialist, honorable discharge, commendations that were the kind that don't appear in official summaries because they involve classified operations, certifications that exceeded the requirements for his current position by such a margin that reading them in context felt, to Vanessa, like discovering that the person you hired to water your plants holds a doctorate in botany. She thought about his words from the night before. "Nobody fought for people like me." She thought about the modification logs he had submitted in a formal report 2 weeks earlier, a report that had been routed to Richard Harlan, the VP of Operations, and had not appeared on Vanessa's desk. That omission was worth thinking about. Richard Harlan had a way of routing things that was worth thinking about more generally. He had been with the company for 11 years. He had been the executive who championed the original jet project. He had also been, she now recalled, the executive who had pushed most aggressively for immediate cancellation. She pulled his file. She started reading. 3 doors down the hall, in his corner office with the view of the East Campus, Richard Harlan was on the phone with someone whose number did not appear in the company directory. And his voice, when he spoke, had the particular quality of a man managing something he would prefer not to have to manage. Hangar 7 caught fire on a Thursday. It was a small fire contained to the electrical conduit run along the north wall, extinguished within 11 minutes by the automatic suppression system, but it was large enough to destroy the secondary power distribution panel that controlled the aircraft system's testing equipment, and it was large enough to set the project back by what the facilities engineer estimated as 3 weeks. With 15 days remaining in the 90-day window, 3 weeks was not a setback. It was a conclusion. The board called an emergency session the following morning. The language in the meeting was measured in the way that language is measured when the people using it have already decided what they want the outcome to be and are performing deliberation for the record. The recommendation was unanimous and simple. Cease project activity. Terminate the contract extension Initiate termination proceedings for project personnel. The final phrase was a formality. Everyone in the room understood which specific member of project personnel was being discussed. Vanessa sat at the head of the table and listened. And her face maintained its trained stillness. And behind that stillness, she was running calculations of a different kind than the ones happening around her. She asked for 48 hours before any formal motion was taken. The board gave it to her, barely. The story reached the press before Vanessa could contain it. A financial column ran a piece under the headline Times, "Female Billionaire Burns Millions Chasing Impossible Dream," asterisk, which was the kind of headline that tells you more about the person who wrote it than the story it claims to be about. The article was inaccurate in its technical details and accurate in its financial ones, which made it precisely the kind of story that does maximum damage because it cannot be fully refuted. Maya saw it. Not the article itself, but the response to it. A classmate at school, whose parent had apparently read the piece and had relayed some version of it to the child, who had relayed some version of that to Maya, in the particular way that children relay damaging information, without malice, without filter, with the complete and devastating honesty of people who have not yet learned that some truths are meant to be withheld. "Your dad is a failure," the classmate had said. "Everybody says so." Maya did not cry at school. She was her father's daughter in this way, and in most ways. She waited until she was home, until she was sitting at the kitchen table with her homework open but untouched, and when Elijah came through the door at 7:15, she looked at him with the particular expression of a child carrying something too heavy for her frame. He sat across from her. He waited. She told him what happened. Her voice was steady for most of it. Elijah drove to Mrs. Patterson's after Maya fell asleep and sat in his car in the parking lot and looked at his hands on the steering wheel for a long time. Then he drove to the hangar, because it was the only place he knew how to be when there was nothing left to say. He was sitting on a metal step stool beside the aircraft's nose section, looking at a schematic spread across his knees, when Vanessa arrived. She had not called ahead. She had driven herself, which she almost never did, and she had come wearing a coat over the outfit she'd had on for a 16-hour day, and she stood in the doorway of the bay and looked at the man who was sitting alone with his schematics in the wreckage of a project the whole world had decided was finished. She looked at the shadow box mounted on the wall of his tool locker. He had brought it from home 3 weeks into the project. A decision he'd never explained, and which no one had asked about. She looked at the stacks of printed specifications, the coffee cups lined up on the workbench like a timeline, the yellow legal pad covered in his handwriting, so compressed it looked like a different alphabet. She looked at the man who had spent 3 months sleeping 4 hours a night, working 2 jobs, raising a daughter alone, and who was still, at midnight, with his future hanging by a thread, holding a schematic and a pencil. "Why didn't you quit?" she asked. Her voice, in the empty hangar, was different than it was in boardrooms, still controlled, but different. Elijah looked up. "My daughter's watching," he said. Vanessa stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she came in and sat down on an overturned equipment crate, and for the first time in 11 years of running a company, Vanessa Cole had a real conversation with someone whose name she had not known 6 months ago, and whose work she had been about to erase. She called the board meeting herself. It was not a regular session. It was called with 12 hours' notice on a Saturday morning, which was unusual enough to generate resentment before anyone arrived. The members filed in, still carrying the energy of interrupted weekends, and Richard Harlan sat in his usual seat, with his usual expression, which was the expression of a man who had decided a long time ago that the way to manage any situation was to project the conviction that the situation was under control. Vanessa did not let the meeting settle. She stood at the head of the table before people had fully removed their coats, and she said, with no preamble, "I am not closing this project." The silence that followed had texture to it, the specific texture of a room recalibrating. She did not wait for the silence to fill itself. "You dismissed him because he came from the hangar instead of Harvard. You looked at his uniform and made a decision about what he was capable of, and you made that decision in about 4 seconds, and you have been defending that decision ever since, because reversing it would require you to admit something about yourselves that none of you are ready to admit." She looked at each face in turn. She held Richard Harlan's gaze for slightly longer than the others. "We are giving Elijah Brooks a full technical team, unrestricted access to all project data, and the remainder of his 90 days. Those are not suggestions, they are decisions." Meeting adjourned. She left before the protest could organize itself. In the hallway, she pulled out her phone and called the head of technical operations. "Get Brooks, whatever he needs," she said. "Everything he asks for." Today, she ended the call and walked to the elevator and did not look back. With the team and the data access, Elijah moved quickly. He had been moving carefully for 3 months, because careful was what the resources available to him required. Now he moved with the contained velocity of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment and was not going to waste it. The technical team, 6 engineers, 2 of whom had actually worked on the original project, arrived at the hangar on Monday morning and found Elijah already there, whiteboard covered in systems diagrams. The relevant sections of the maintenance log bookmarked with yellow tape. He did not make a speech. He handed each of them a printed section of the software modification log and said, "Tell me what you see." Within 2 hours, the consensus was unambiguous. The modifications to the pressurization control software were not accidental. They were not the result of a coding error or a miscommunication between development teams. They were deliberate, they were systematic, and they bore the fingerprints, metaphorical ones, but traceable, of someone with high-level system access and a reason to want the aircraft to fail. Elijah had known this for weeks. Now he had 6 engineers who also knew it. The next question was simpler and more consequential. Who had that access? The system log had timestamps. The access credentials associated with the unauthorized modifications belonged to a service account that had been created 11 months earlier and had been used exactly twice, once to make the modifications and once to delete its own creation record. The deletion had been performed imperfectly, because deletion always is. Elijah had reconstructed it from the backup partition. The service account had been created from a workstation on the executive floor during a time window when building access records showed only one person in the building. Richard Harlan had a maintenance contract with a third-party avionics firm that held a substantial insurance policy against project failure. Elijah brought this to Vanessa with a printout and a USB drive and a level of documented specificity that left very little interpretive space. Vanessa read it twice. Then she made 2 phone calls, one to the company's general counsel and one to a contact she maintained in the Federal Aviation Regulatory Office. The next morning, 2 vehicles with federal plates arrived in the Cole Aerospace executive parking lot, and Richard Harlan, who had spent 11 years managing things, found himself in a situation that could not be managed. He was walked out through the lobby, not the private elevator, not the side entrance, while the remaining board members watched from the windows above. The lobby had a glass atrium ceiling. It was a bright, clear morning. There was nowhere that was not illuminated. The jet, still on the ground, still unflown, remained the central fact. Evidence of sabotage explained the failure. It did not repair the aircraft. With the federal investigation underway and Richard's scheme exposed, the board's posture shifted from hostility to something closer to paralysis. The particular paralysis of people who have backed the wrong horse and are waiting to see how badly that will cost them. Vanessa called a press conference before Elijah had asked her to, not because it was strategically ideal, but because the story had already reached the press from multiple directions, and allowing it to be shaped by sources other than themselves would be worse. She presented the evidence. She described the sabotage plainly. She named no ongoing federal investigation by name, but she confirmed its existence. She stated that the project would continue. In the rear of the press conference room, standing near the back wall the way he had stood at the rear of the boardroom 90 days earlier, Elijah watched. When the questions were finished and the journalists were filing out, Vanessa caught his eye across the room. She said nothing. Neither did he. He turned and walked back toward the hangar, because there was still work to do, and he had never needed an audience to do it. The day of the final test was cold and sharp, the kind of autumn morning that sharpens outlines and makes everything look more consequential than it might otherwise. They had chosen a Tuesday, which seemed deliberately undramatic, And yet when the gates of Cole Aerospace's private test facility opened at 7 in the morning, there were already journalists outside. Word had moved through industry channels faster than anyone had predicted. And the story, the sabotage, the federal action, the maintenance mechanic who had refused to surrender, had acquired the gravity that stories acquire when they are genuinely true. The aircraft sat on the tarmac in the early light, and it looked, in that light, different than it had looked in the hangar for 2 years. In the hangar it had looked like a problem. On the tarmac it looked like what it actually was, a machine designed to fly, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to do so. The board had assembled near the observation area. Some of them had come out of genuine curiosity. Some had come because not attending would be conspicuous. None of them looked comfortable. Vanessa stood apart from them, at the edge of the tarmac, hands in the pockets of her coat, watching the final systems checks with the focused stillness of someone who has placed everything they have on a single outcome and has made their peace with that. Elijah ran through the pre-flight sequence with the thoroughness of someone who had, in another life, done this under conditions that did not allow for mistakes. The technical team stood at the ground station. The aircraft systems showed green across every board. He strapped in. He ran through the engine start sequence. The left engine turned over and caught with a sound that Elijah had heard in his mind every night for 3 months. The right engine followed. The instruments showed nominal. He released the brake, and the aircraft moved forward onto the runway. And at the end of the runway it stopped. And it sat for a moment in the cold morning air. And Elijah thought briefly, intensely, the way you think of someone when the thing they believed in is about to be proved right or wrong of Caroline. She had told him once, not as a metaphor but as a literal statement about what she observed in him. Asterisk. You were born to build things that fly. Asterisk. He had been home on leave, and they were standing in the backyard of the house they rented in Virginia Beach, and he had been tinkering with a model engine he'd bought at a hardware store because he was between assignments and his hands needed something to hold, and she had said it with the complete confidence of someone stating a documented fact. He had laughed it off. He should have listened sooner. He advanced the throttle. The engines climbed through their power range with a sound like controlled weather, a sound that could be felt in the chest and the soles of the feet, the kind of sound that makes every other sound seem provisional by comparison. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, and the morning light threw its shadow behind it, and at 162 knots the nose came up and the wheels left the ground. There was a moment, one specific, unheld breath of a moment, between the last wheel contact and the point at which the aircraft was definitively airborne, when the outcome was still technically uncertain, when the physics was still negotiating. And then there was no uncertainty. The aircraft rose. The gear retracted cleanly. The engines held their tone through the climb. It was, from a technical standpoint, a textbook departure. Stable, correct, unremarkable, except in every way. Vanessa Cole, standing at the edge of the tarmac, experienced a sensation that she had last experienced at 29 years old, the night she signed the papers that launched her first company. The sensation of something abstract becoming real, of a thing she had committed to before she had any right to commit to it, arriving in the world as an actual fact. She was not, as a general rule, a person who cried in public or in private, and the water that came to her eyes in that moment was something she acknowledged, and then set aside with the same efficiency she applied to everything she could not immediately use. Maya was there. She had arrived with Mrs. Patterson at 6:30 in the morning, which was before the press and before the board and before almost everyone except the technical team. She stood at the chain-link fence, at the edge of the public observation area, her hands wrapped around the links, and when the wheels left the ground, she said, in a voice that was less than a shout and more than a whisper, "My dad's gonna make it fly." The person standing next to her, a journalist who had been hoping for a dramatic failure, and found herself unexpectedly moved by something else entirely, did not write that line in her story, because she could not figure out how to make it fit the narrative she had already written in her head. She thought about it for a long time afterward. The aircraft flew for 42 minutes. It completed its test circuit over the facility, reached altitude without incident, held cruise configuration for 20 minutes, and returned for a landing that was, by the assessment of the technical team monitoring from the ground station, exactly as smooth as the engineers who designed the system had intended it to be when they designed it 4 years earlier. When the wheels touched down and the thrust reversers engaged, and the aircraft slowed to taxi speed, the technical team at the ground station began doing what people do when something they have worked on in good faith for a long time finally works. Some of them talked too loudly about technical details. Some of them stood very still. One of them, a young engineer named Foster, who had joined the team 3 weeks earlier, and therefore had the least personal investment in the outcome, simply sat down on the ground outside the ground station and looked at the sky. And nobody thought it was strange. The hangar workers who had known Elijah for years, who had worked alongside him through double shifts and equipment failures, and the particular indignities that maintenance workers absorb as a condition of their employment, came out from the hangar bays and stood along the taxiway. When the aircraft came past, they did not cheer in the performative way that crowds cheer at sporting events. They put their hands together, steadily, the way people applaud something that has earned it, and the sound of it was not loud, but it carried. Elijah shut down the engines in the designated spot, and the ground crew moved in, and the systems powered down in sequence, and he sat in the cockpit for a moment after everything was quiet, and he thought, asterisk, all right then. Asterisk, it was not a dramatic thought. It was the kind of thought that a person has when they have finished a thing they set out to do, and the doing of it has confirmed something about themselves that they always suspected but never quite had proof of. He opened the cockpit and climbed down, and Maya was there at the bottom of the ladder, because Vanessa had walked her through the gate herself, and Maya wrapped her arms around his waist with the full force of a 10-year-old who has been standing on the other side of a fence, hoping harder than she has ever hoped for anything. And Elijah put his arms around her and stood on the tarmac in the autumn light, and was, for a moment, nothing more complicated than a father whose daughter was glad to see him. The press conference that afternoon was different in character from the one Vanessa had held the previous week. That one had been a defense. This one was a fact. She stood at the podium with the same precision she always stood at podiums. But something in her posture had shifted. Some small degree of the controlled distance that she maintained between herself and the world had moved, and it showed in the way it always shows, not in what was said but in how it landed. She announced the formal continuation of the aircraft program. She announced that the investigation into the sabotage had resulted in a federal referral, and she announced, last and clearly, that Elijah Brooks had been appointed head of aerospace innovation at Cole Aerospace, effective immediately, with a direct reporting line to her office and full authority over the company's next-generation development program. The board, sitting in the front row, received this news with the visible effort of people swallowing something that did not go down smoothly. They received it nonetheless. There were things you could contest before a flight, and things you could not contest after one, and the board had been in the aviation business long enough to understand the distinction. The journalists in the room, who had come for a story about failure, found themselves recalibrating their angles in real time. One of them, the journalist who had been standing next to Maya at the fence, wrote her new story that night and submitted it at 11 o'clock. The headline was, Single Dad Mechanic Saves $1 Billion Jet. It was not the most precise headline she had ever written. It was the most accurate one. 3 months later, Elijah signed a lease on a house. It was a small house, 3 bedrooms, a backyard with a tree Maya had already identified as suitable for a rope swing, a garage with enough electrical capacity to support a serious workbench. The move took 1 weekend, because they did not own much, which had always been true, and because 3 of Elijah's colleagues from the hangar showed up on Saturday morning with a rented truck and a willingness to lift heavy objects that required no explanation and accepted no discussion of compensation. Maya supervised from the curb, directing traffic with the authoritative precision of a person who has been waiting a long time for this, and has spent that waiting time developing an organizational system. Her room was the second largest bedroom, which she had negotiated on the drive over by making an argument that Elijah found genuinely difficult to rebut about the importance of having adequate space for both a study area and a hobby area. He gave her the room. He painted it the color she chose. He hung the photograph. She asked him to hang a photograph taken by Mrs. Patterson on the afternoon of the test flight. showing the aircraft in the air above the tarmac with a small figure visible in the background. Maya, at the fence, looking up. She taped it herself. Above her desk, at exactly the height where she would see it first thing every morning. On the wall in the hallway between their rooms, Elijah hung the shadow box with the service medal, which had always been on a wall somewhere but had never felt, until now, like it was on the right wall. He looked at it the evening they finished unpacking, after Maya was asleep and the house was quiet, with the particular quality of quietness that new houses have on the first night. The quietness of space, waiting to be filled with the sounds of a life. He thought about what Vanessa had said to him the week before, in her office, in the kind of private moment that exists between two people who have been through something together and need to say out loud what they have learned from it before the ordinary momentum of their separate lives makes the saying harder. She had leaned back in her chair and looked at the city outside her window. The same city, the same view, 42 floors above a skyline she had built, and she had said, "I spent 20 years believing that money built empires." She paused. "I was wrong. People do." Elijah had not responded immediately, because it was the kind of statement that deserved the space to stand on its own for a moment. Then he said, "You already knew that. You just needed a reason to act on it." Vanessa had looked at him with the expression of someone who has been more accurately described than they are entirely comfortable with, and then she had almost smiled, which was, for her, the equivalent of a standing ovation. He stood in the hallway of the new house and looked at the medal on the wall, and he thought about what it meant to fight for something without knowing whether the fight would come to anything, and what it costs, and what it returns. He thought about Caroline and about Maya, and about an aircraft that had been declared dead and had flown anyway. He thought about the particular kind of faith required to stand in the back of a room full of people who have decided not to see you and say, with a voice that does not shake, "Give me 90 days, There is a photograph that hangs in the Cole Aerospace lobby, at eye level, in the space beside the main reception desk, where executives walk past every morning on their way to the elevators. It shows a jet aircraft in the air over a test facility on a cold autumn morning. The light is clean. The aircraft is in a shallow climb, gear already retracted, climbing smoothly away from the frame. Beneath the aircraft, at the edge of the tarmac, barely visible at the photograph's scale, there are two figures. One tall, one small, standing close together. The photograph has no caption, because Vanessa decided the photograph did not require one. What it required was to be there, at eye level, where people would see it on their way to and from whatever mattered to them that day. And the world, which had called the flight impossible, which had called the man who attempted it too unqualified, too ordinary, too easily dismissed to even merit serious consideration, found that it had been wrong in the particular way that the world is wrong when it decides too quickly what a person is capable of, and looks only at the uniform when there is something far more significant underneath. The jet flies regularly now. It is the first of 3 planned aircraft in what will become Cole Aerospace's most significant program. The one that, in the technical journals, is described in the dry language of performance metrics and fuel efficiency ratios. In the hangar, where the workers who knew Elijah from his maintenance years still work, it is described differently. It is described as the one nobody believed in. The one that almost didn't happen. The one that a man with grease on his hands and a daughter watching from a fence decided, without permission and without apology, to make fly. And up above, somewhere in the clean altitude where engines hold their tone and the sky goes on without qualification, it keeps doing exactly that.